Today we begin the first of 3 lectures on the bureaucracy. So what is the bureaucracy? Well, the bureaucracy is the agencies and offices devoted to carrying out the tasks of government consistent with the law. The bureaucracy, in other words, is the executive branch of the government. And of course, as you know, at the top of the executive branch sits the President of the United States. Let me start with a puzzle. Why does bureaucracy have such a bad reputation in the United States? Well, it turns out that this bad reputation is not just limited to the United States. Bureaucracy turns out to be quite unpopular almost no matter where you are in the world. Here are some potential initial problems. Bureaucracy, it's been said, serves as a vehicle for patronage or clientelism. Patronage and clientelism are two sides of the same coin, where a more powerful and well-connected patron obtains benefits and opportunities or jobs for his or her clients in exchange for political support. Bureaucrats can sometimes be appointed, and indeed at the upper levels of U.S. government are routinely appointed, not because they are particularly good at their jobs, but as a reward for political support, as a reward for their faithful support of usually the president. If appointments are not meritocratic, performance in bureaucracy suffers, especially when compared with a competitive and cutthroat private sector. Bureaucrats also may not have a strong incentive to solve the problems they are tasked with. After all, why should they work themselves out of a job? So, for some jobs, this is obviously not going to be the case, right? There is always a continuous demand for driver's licenses, right? So no matter how much a worker at the DMV works, there is always going to be more people who need to get their driver's licenses renewed or their registrations renewed. And so from that perspective, there's no problem to solve. But you might think of other kinds of bureaucrats whose task is to eliminate certain kinds of problems. You could imagine the war on poverty or the war on drugs. These are social problems that it is said we need to eradicate. And if the job requires eradication of poverty, then at some point the job is, we would expect, done. A third problem with bureaucracy is a lack of competition, right? There is no market for most services offered by bureaucrats, and so this lack of competition means that the motivation to succeed may not be always as strong among bureaucrats. After all, whether you solve the problem or not, you are going to still have a job tomorrow, or at least that might be the attitude. A fourth issue is because they are tasked with changing society from above, so to speak. Bureaucrats often upset existing arrangements on the ground that people accept and find legitimate. Solving coordination problems and collective action problems is necessarily coercive, right? We call them stag hunts, right? Solving stag hunts necessarily involves at some point being able to impose penalties on the people who don't cooperate. So if you want to reduce pollution, if you want to reduce traffic congestion in some way, you may end up having to issue orders to people about where and when they can drive, or what kind of catalytic converters they have to install in their cars. All of these things are costly and, of course, are backed up by force of law. Which brings us to the last point. America is the land of freedom. In America, perhaps more than other places, people resent intrusions upon their lives, and perhaps they also trust that individuals on their own can come up with solutions to their problems without having to go cry to government for help, so to speak. And so, for all these reasons, bureaucracies tend to have a bad reputation. But is this reputation undeserved? Well, I think there's a sense in which this reputation very well is undeserved, and a sense in which it is completely deserved. Let me explain. Part of the problem with American bureaucracy is a problem it shares in common with all large, hierarchical, monopolistic organizations. American bureaucracy is basically a very long series of principal agent problems. American bureaucracy is also judged relative to a highly efficient private sector. In the United States, the private sector functions very well relative to many places in the world. And so, when faced with this comparison, bureaucracy must always necessarily come up short. It always looks bad in comparison with the private sector, which is full of innovation and full of low prices and cheap products and services. The public sector arguably exists in part because there are goods and services the private sector cannot produce. And so, in that sense, the comparison is unfair. Many sorts of goods that governments end up providing are public goods. They're goods that the private sector can't provide at a profit. And so, it's not surprising that it's not going to be particularly efficient in providing them. Another reason why the reputation might be undeserved is that in cross country comparisons, when comparing American bureaucracy, particularly the American federal bureaucracy, with the bureaucracies of other developed countries in the world, like Western Europe and Japan, the United States actually does fairly well in measures of bureaucratic efficiencies. A Belgian scholar, Van de Walle, in 2005 ranked the United States as the number two bureaucracy in the world at efficiency and number nine in overall performance. This is probably surprising to most Americans, but it's worth noting that all citizens of developed countries complain about their bureaucracies, but some of them must be better than others. On the other hand, it's worth noting there's a sense in which the reputation very much is deserved. Bureaucracy has not solved the problems it was set up to address. A lot of the big social problems that bureaucrats are given power and resources to try and solve are as bad or worse than they were when they started. I already mentioned the war on drugs, the war on poverty. All of these issues are issues that remain as present today as the day when the DEA was created or TANF was created. These things do not seem to have disappeared despite many, many millions and billions of dollars sunk into trying to solve them. A second point is that it's not always entirely clear whether the goods and services provided by the bureaucracy are in fact necessary. When the bureaucracy issues licenses, for example, other businesses have private licensing arrangements where certification is not done by the government, but certification of standards is done by the private sector. In other cases, you have cases where the government may be crowding out the private sector. Crowding out simply means by providing a service backed up by taxpayer money that makes the service difficult for the private sector to provide. One example of this is in the 1900s with lighthouses, and another example is the federal highway system. Both of these things were started by the private sector and had a certain number of private companies operating them, but for a variety of reasons, the federal government or state governments stepped in to provide that service, and thereby rendering the private business unprofitable. A final reason why this reputation might well be deserved is that over time, legislatures, that is, say, Congress, has delegated more and more powers, more and more lawmaking powers to bureaucrats. This is called administrative law, in contrast to the statutory law that is passed by Congress. So when Congress tells the Environmental Protection Agency, you come up with a set of rules to deal with this problem, it's delegating the lawmaking power to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. And this is often a source of tension and a source of resentment on the part of whomever it happens to be who's being regulated. Okay, so that concludes lecture number one. Join me for a second lecture on bureaucracy and the principal agent problem next.